The Flaxborough Borough Library did not, as a rule, attract drama. Its usual disturbances consisted of squabbles over overdue gardening manuals or the rare but spirited competition for the one functioning microfilm viewer. The chief librarian, Miss Edna Birtwistle, believed firmly in the kind of order that required both signage and the glare of someone who had perfected the art of making adults feel like reprimanded schoolchildren. On the drizzly Thursday afternoon, the trouble began. Miss Birtwistle stood at her usual command post, the central desk, where she could survey all shelves and thereby ensure the moral and organizational integrity of the fiction section. She was a woman who took shelving errors personally. A crime novel incorrectly placed in general literature struck her as an attack on civilization itself. At precisely 3:30, the town's routine peace suffered what, for Flaxborough, amounted to a shock. A faint metallic clang echoed from the reference room, a sound wholly out of keeping with the usual ambience of soft page turning and gentle throat clearing. Miss Birtwistle frowned, straightened her spine, and moved with swift librarian authority toward the sound. She did not get far. Halfway across the parquet floor, she stopped, her expression tightening as though she had spotted an unreturned book lurking in someone's satchel. On the floor near the reference room entrance lay a small brass date stamp, one of the old-fashioned ones that clicked emphatically when pressed onto an ink pad. It was an object that never left her desk. Library volunteers had been lectured with diagrams on the sanctity of that date stamp's place. Miss Birtwistle stooped to retrieve it, muttering darkly about incompetent assistants. But before her hand reached it, Mr. Cyril Bloom, the town's senior church warden, and a man whose sense of propriety rivaled her own, appeared from behind the frosted glass door of the reference room, looking rather more flushed than usual. "Miss Birtwistle," he said, smoothing his thinning hair as though it might conceal his guilt. "I wonder if you might think that there's something I'd appreciate you taking a look at." Now, Mr. Bloom was not a man who normally required assistance with anything, least of all, books. His approach to reference texts was methodical, reverential, and according to some wags bordering on ecclesiastical. Miss Birtwistle narrowed her eyes, tucked the date stamp into her palm like a weapon, and followed him through the door. The reference room was dimmer than the main library, lit only by 2 green-shaded lamps and the grey daylight leaking through tall Georgian windows. It smelled of polished oak, starch, and slightly damp catalogues. Miss Birtwistle stepped inside, expecting a shelving catastrophe, or worse still, an unauthorized moving of chairs. What she found instead was rather more troubling. On the large oak table in the center of the room lay a stack of reference books, all open and spread like the aftermath of a frantic search. But that was not the true source of Bloom's agitation. It was the figure slumped in the high-backed reading chair, head bent forward as though engrossed in a line of text. Miss Birtwistle approached, already preparing a scolding remark about food or drink at the tables, but the words evaporated. She stopped sharply. The man in the chair, Mr. Arnold Peebles, the library's part-time archivist and full-time pedant, was very still. Far too still. "Mr. Bloom," she whispered, her voice tightening, "when you say something, I trust you don't mean I'm afraid I do." Bloom swallowed. He won't respond. I tried speaking to him. Twice. Miss Birtwistle, who had no medical training beyond a first aid course taken reluctantly in 1987, reached out and laid 2 stiff fingers on Peebles's wrist. She felt nothing. His skin was cool. The air around him carried a faint scent. She couldn't place something metallic, maybe chemical, or simply the dust of old paper. A chill that had nothing to do with the unheated reference room crept across her back. She stepped away, pressing the brass date stamp tightly in her hand as though it might anchor her to routine. "Mr. Bloom, we must telephone the police." He nodded gravely. "Yes. Quiet. The police." But he didn't move. For a man so deeply committed to civic duty, he somehow found himself curiously rooted to the carpet. Miss Birtwistle drew a sharp breath, marched to her desk, and dialed the station with swift, decisive pressure. Her voice, when she spoke, held the steely timbre of someone who refused to be emotionally undermined by a sudden corpse. "This is the Borough Library. We require Inspector Purbright at once." "Yes, at once." "There has been a—" She paused, unwilling to use the word. It felt untidy. A situation. Within 15 minutes, Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Sid Greatorex entered the library, trailing droplets of rain and a faint smell of damp uniform. Purbright's expression was as mild as the drizzle, his eyes wandering with polite curiosity around the room as though he'd arrived for a quiet afternoon browse. Miss Birtwistle led them to the reference room with the dignity of a woman escorting guests to a particularly disappointing exhibit. Purbright stepped inside, gazing at the overturned books, the slumped figure, and the brass date stamp still clenched in her hand. "Ah," he murmured with his usual mild understatement, "a rather final sort of overdue situation." Sergeant Greatorex cleared his throat. "Looks like Mr. Peebles, sir. Wouldn't have taken him for the dramatic type." Purbright leaned in slightly, studying Peebles' posture, the arrangement of books, the faint scent in the air. Then he looked at the date stamp in Miss Birtwistle's grip. "Has that been out of your sight today?" "Certainly not," she replied, affronted. Then, after a beat, "Except, perhaps, for a moment." "I did go to replace the ink pad." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. Outside the library, word had already begun its migration across Flaxborough, carried by shoppers, by the postmistress's niece, by the butcher's wife, who had seen the police car arrive and instantly assumed a scandal of national security proportions. By sunset, the entire town would know someone had died in the reference room, and at least 3 versions of why. Inside, Purbright straightened, hands clasped behind his back. "Well," he said softly, "I think we should begin by asking a few gentle questions." His tone was mild, almost casual, but Miss Birtwistle, Mr. Bloom, and the silently gossiping volunteers sensed with a faint collective shiver that this was the beginning of something the town would not easily shell. Inspector Purbright remained in the reference room just long enough to let the silence settle. It behaved differently now, heavier, expectant, as though the books themselves were leaning forward to listen. Mr. Peebles did not look any less deceased, but Purbright's observations had shifted. They were no longer about the body, but about the room that contained it. He glanced once more at the ring of reference volumes. Their arrangement had a peculiar tidiness to it, despite the impression of hurried searching. Anyone who genuinely ransacked a table tended to leave signs of untidy human anxiety. This looked more like a display. Sergeant Greatorex took a half-step closer to the body, then reconsidered. He kept his hands firmly tucked behind him. "He doesn't seem to have moved much, sir." "No," Purbright murmured, "and he won't again." But some conversation might have occurred shortly before he stopped being helpful. Miss Birtwistle, anxious to maintain order even in matters of mortality, pressed her lips into a firm line. She was watching Purbright's eyes rather than the corpse, curious in spite of herself. "Inspector, Mr. Peebles arrived 13 minutes past 2. I noted it. He had requested access to the borough maps and the local directories." "And how did he appear?" Purbright asked softly. "Appear?" "As he always appeared." "Exacting, irritated by someone's earlier misshelving of the 1924 almanac." "Ah." Purbright looked mildly disappointed in the predictability of human nature rather than in her answer. "And Mr. Bloom?" Mr. Bloom, still hovering like a man trying not to be accused of something, lifted his brows. "I only came in to consult the diocesan listings. I found him just as you see." "Well," he hesitated. "Almost as you see. The books were already open, but the date stamp was not on the floor when I first entered." Purbright's interest lifted a fraction. "Not on the floor?" "No, I'm quite sure of it. I would have noticed. Miss Burt Whistle emitted a faint, scathing hum. If Mr. Bloom says he would have noticed, then he would. Purbright offered no comment, but he tucked the information away, quietly, discreetly, and with the mild civility of a man folding an umbrella. A constable arrived to begin the formal procedures. Purbright stepped aside, permitting the scene to be recorded with the appropriate solemnity. He watched the constable photographing the books at the table. One of the reference volumes was open to a map of the county's drainage system. Another displayed entries listing farms and outbuildings. The last appeared to be a directory of old borough trustees. None of these seemed immediately likely to induce death. When the body was finally removed, the room felt a little less like a suspended breath. Purbright asked Miss Burt Whistle to accompany him to the main desk. She obeyed with reluctant briskness. "You mentioned replacing an ink pad earlier," Purbright said. "Where is the new one kept?" "In the cupboard beneath the desk, Inspector." She opened it, producing a small cardboard box, unused. "I assure you, I follow procedure strictly." "I would expect nothing less," he replied gently. "And did Mr. Peebles ever requested the stamp?" "Never. He had no reason to." A stiff pause. "The date stamp leaving the desk without my knowledge it is unthinkable." "Yet it did," Purbright said. "Not accusatory, just factual." She inhaled sharply, perhaps affronted by the universe. Before she could respond, Greatorex leaned over from the nearest shelving unit. "Sir, one of the volunteers says she saw someone leave the library about 10 minutes before Mr. Bloom raised the alarm." Miss Burt Whistle stiffened. And who might that have been? The volunteer, a young woman with a nervous smile and spectacles too large for her face, approached gingerly. "It was Mrs. Dalamer, miss. She came in asking about parish newsletters from the 70s. She said she wanted to check something from the Women's Guild minutes. She didn't stay long." Mrs. Dalamer, Purbright reflected, was the sort of person who believed deeply in the moral usefulness of being involved in everything. She also believed on alternate Mondays that most people were up to something faintly improper. "Did she seem hurried?" Purbright asked. "Well, perhaps a little." She kept glancing at the reference room door before she left. Miss Burt Whistle let out a disdainful exhale. Mrs. Dalamer glances at everything. Suspicion is practically her hobby. Purbright thanked the volunteer, asked a few mild follow-up questions, then noted down the timing. The sequence formed a faint line in his mind, not yet a pattern, but something close to a path. "Inspector," Mr. Bloom said quietly, "might it have been his heart? Peebles was not a man of robust, anything." "Quite possible," Purbright agreed. "But possible is not the same as certain, and certainty is what we're after." Greatorex shifted uneasily, as though certainty was a luxury rarely achieved in police work, but admirable to aim for. "Shall we speak with Mrs. Dalamer, sir?" "In due time," Purbright replied. "But first, I'd like to understand what Mr. Peebles was looking for." "Miss Burt Whistle, could I see the log of his reference material?" "Requests today." She produced it with stiff efficiency. Purbright skimmed the boring, bureaucratic and precise, until one line caught his eye: Town Archives, Trustee Records, Confidential Section. "Curious," he murmured. "These are usually accessed only by appointment." "Yes," Miss Burt Whistle said tightly. "He insisted, said it was urgent. And did he mention why?" "No, but he was quite insistent that he would not leave without examining them." Purbright closed the log, thanking her. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into something more committed. Flaxborough, in its comfortable way, continued bustling, entirely unaware of how much gossip would blossom by evening. Inside the library, Purbright took one last look at the quiet reference room. The books were still open where they had been, forming that oddly deliberate ring. Something too neat, too arranged, "Sergeant," he said softly, "I think Mr. Peebles found something he shouldn't have." Greatorex blinked. And someone else decided he shouldn't keep it? Purbright offered the faintest smile. Possibly. Or perhaps he merely saw something inconvenient. He turned toward the exit. "Well then, let's begin with Mrs. Dallimer. She may have seen more than she intended. People often do." As they stepped out into the dull afternoon, Purbright's gaze lifted briefly to the tall library windows. Their reflection held the faint distortion of the rooms inside, an indistinct ghost of the tableau he had just inspected. He felt the stirrings of something faint but undeniable, an itch of a pattern. And somewhere, in that pattern, a very quiet truth waited with surprising patience. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Greatorex found Mrs. Dallimer precisely where one would expect her at 4 o'clock on a Thursday. In the church hall, bending the ear of anyone unfortunate enough to pause within conversational reach. She presided over the parish fund committee table like a matronly hawk, armed with lists, teacups, and an authority she wielded without formal appointment. She looked up with quick, bright suspicion when the two officers entered. "Inspector Purbright, Sergeant, I assure you, whatever this is about, I have already submitted the January accounts. They were 10 pence short, but only because Mr. Waddington tried to reimburse himself for biscuits he never purchased." Purbright smiled gently. "This isn't about biscuits, Mrs. Dallimer." "Oh." Her voice rose a half step. "Then what, pray, has gone wrong now?" "Not gone wrong, exactly," Purbright said mildly. "Just a small matter of timing, an observation. You were at the Borough Library not long before Mr. Peebles was discovered." She tensed immediately, not with guilt, but with the offended dignity of a woman unaccustomed to seeing her errands catalogued. "I was researching Women's Guild minutes from 1978, if anyone must know. There was a discrepancy regarding our annual Christmas pudding subscription. Someone tampered with the figures, and Greatorex, in a moment of doomed curiosity, asked, 'Tampered with the pudding subscription?' 'A conspiracy,' she declared, 'but not relevant here.'" Purbright steered gently. "Did you see Mr. Peebles while you were in the library?" Mrs. Dallimer pressed her lips together, thinking. "Only in passing." Through the reference room door, he was sitting with those great heavy books in front of him, looking rather pale. Well, paler than usual. He had that habit of turning the pages with his fingertips, as though he didn't want the books to bite. "And did anyone else enter the room while you were there?" Purbright asked. She hesitated. "Not enter, no. But someone did walk past me rather quickly in the corridor. I couldn't quite see who it was. Grey coat, shortish, carrying something." "Carrying what?" Greatorex asked. "A book, or it might have been a folder. I only saw a corner of it. Red, I think." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "And you didn't speak to them?" "I didn't have the chance. They moved as though it was late for a train, which is rarely a characteristic of Flaxborough residents." Purbright thanked her with impeccable politeness. Mrs. Dallimer, relieved at having provided something potentially vital, instantly launched into a detailed recounting of her guild's committee disputes. The inspector eased himself and Greatorex toward the door like a pair of men escaping a polite ambush. Outside, the drizzle had begun to taper off, though the town retained the washed-out pallor of mid-afternoon resignation. Greatorex shoved his hands deeper into his pockets. "Sir, a grey coat and something red could be half the town." "Yes," Purbright mused, "but half the town is a manageable number when one starts trimming away those who had any reason to know what Mr. Peebles was looking up today. And do we know the reason yet?" "No." But Mr. Peebles knew, and he was interested enough to insist on seeing confidential records. They walked down the gentle slope toward Market Street, the pavement glistening faintly as if polished for inspection. The shops displayed their usual modest wares, nothing likely, Purbright thought, to provoke homicide. The people inside them, however, were another matter. Human nature, he reflected, was capable of far more mischief than soap flakes and tea towels. He stopped outside Grimble & Sons Tailoring. A grey coat, one very similar to the vague description hung in the window, its collar turned up just enough to suggest anonymity. Purbright stared at it a moment, then continued walking without comment. Symbolism was of no real use. Only particulars mattered. "Sir," Greatorex said, glancing at him, "do you think someone followed Peebles into the reference room?" "Possibly. Or perhaps someone arrived before him and left something for him to find. Something persuasive." Purbright did not explain further. Greatorex, by now accustomed to the inspector's habit of speaking in gentle ellipse, made no attempt to unravel the remark prematurely. As they reached the square, a familiar figure emerged from the doorway of the newsagent's. Councillor Wavish, the sort of man who considered civic duty only slightly less important than driving his Austin in second gear, even when first was clearly required, spotted them and approached with all the enthusiasm of someone preparing to involve himself. "I say, Inspector, awfully rum business at the library." Purbright inclined his head. "Good afternoon, Councillor. I've heard no less than 3 accounts already," Wavish announced, one involving poisoned ink, another suggesting a quarrel over map scales, and one most dramatically claiming a scuffle with a foreigner. Greatorex coughed. "Do any of those have names attached?" "Oh, heavens, no, but it does seem frightfully unfortunate for the borough. Dead archivists are rarely attractive in annual reports." Purbright maintained a thoughtful silence. "Councillor, did you know Mr. Peebles well? Do you know him?" "Only through committee tedium. He was terribly fond of correcting minutes. Could spot an out-of-date punctuation mark at 20 paces. Did he have disagreements with anyone on the council recently?" Wavish frowned. "Well, there was the matter of the municipal records reorganization. Peebles objected strongly to certain files being, how shall I put it, streamlined." Purbright's eyebrows rose slightly. "Streamlined? Yes. Older documents irrelevant, or so some argued. Peebles was adamant they should remain untouched." Wavish leaned closer, as though revealing state secrets. He said there were inconsistencies in the trustee listings from the 1950s. Threatened to make a report about it. "And did he?" "Not that I'm aware." Purbright thanked him, offering no hint of what impressed him or what bored him. The councillor departed, evidently pleased to have played a part in local justice. Greatorex exhaled slowly. "So the trustee records. Same as the log entry?" "Yes," Purbright murmured, and those inconsistencies might have been more than clerical. They crossed back toward the station through streets growing dimmer, the afternoon fading into early evening. Somewhere in the shadowed distance, Purbright felt the subtle weight of the day beginning to form its own quiet outline. Peebles had been searching for something precise. Someone else had been equally certain he should not succeed. The inspector paused at a lamp post, eyes drifting to the faint reflections in the puddles at his feet, distortions of the sky, the buildings, the town itself. Sometimes answers emerged from distortions, not the clear images people preferred. Sergeant Purbright said almost gently, "I think our next task is to identify who would benefit from certain borough records staying quietly asleep." "And who feared Mr. Peebles might wake them," Greatorex added. Purbright nodded once. "Exactly." Inspector Purbright did not proceed directly to the station. Instead, he took a measured detour toward the borough offices, a building that had once been a proud municipal centre, but now resembled a respectable old relative being quietly shuffled into comfortable irrelevance. The lights shone dimly through the windows, giving the place a faintly apologetic glow. Inside, the air smelled of paper that had been filed too many times. A clerk looked up from a typewriter with the expression of someone who hoped urgently not to be spoken to. Purbright nodded gently in her direction, which she accepted as politely as possible without encouraging conversation. "We're here to see the trustee archives," Purbright told her. Her fingers froze a fraction above the keys. "Oh, those." "Yes," he replied. "Precisely those." She hesitated, then rose with the solemn reluctance of someone assisting in the opening of a long unused tomb. "You'll want room 3. But the key, well, you'll need Mrs. Fosdyke." Mrs. Fosdyke proved to be a short woman of enormous efficiency, the sort who believed bureaucracy was a sacred trust. She looked at Purbright with the calm suspicion of someone accustomed to seeing files mishandled by the unworthy. "Inspector, may I ask," she began, "why the police are taking an interest in the trustee records? They're not what one might call lively material." Purbright, who had mastered the art of saying almost nothing with great politeness, replied, "Simply a matter of context. Mrs. Fosdyke produced a small ring of keys. Well, context or no context, you'll find the originals in room 3. I must warn you, though, that much of it is dreadfully dull." She lowered her voice. "Decades of minutes from meetings in which nothing happened except disagreements about window glazing. Those are often the most dangerous disagreements," Purbright murmured. Her expression suggested she suspected him of making a joke, but was not entirely prepared to assume it. Room 3 was cool and lined with shelves of battered leather arch files. Dust seemed to gather here with an almost devotional loyalty. Purbright glanced around, taking in the faint smell of cardboard and old ink. Greatorex looked less comfortable. The room gave the impression of closing in on anyone who entered without a clear purpose. Purbright selected the stack labeled Trustees 1939 to 1962 and placed it on a wooden table. The files were heavy, as though carrying the weight of old decisions and mild improprieties. He opened one with the careful touch of a man accustomed to handling delicate history. Greatorex leaned over. "Sir, do you think Peebles found something in these that upset someone?" "I think," Purbright said slowly, "he found something that didn't want to be found again." They skimmed through the early entries. Most dealt with mundane matters: repairs to the municipal hall roof, allocation of funds for commemorative benches, and a long-running battle over who should be responsible for replacing the broken flagpole. But then Purbright turned a page and paused. A name appeared that he had not expected. Alfred P. Dunning, trustee from 1954 to 1957. Greatorex frowned. "Dunning, that name rings a bell." "It should," Purbright replied. "He was involved in that old scandal about the cemetery maintenance fund. Something about misallocated costs, if memory serves. Didn't he leave town after that?" "Rather quickly." Purbright flipped forward. "And here, look at this. Minutes from a meeting on June 12, 1956. Dunning disputes an entry regarding an endowment that claims the figure is incorrect, but no correction appears in subsequent meetings." Greatorex scratched his head. So either they ignored him or someone quietly fixed it later. Or, Purbright said gently, someone didn't wish it fixed. He studied the signature list. Several names faded, but one stood out with unmistakable firmness. Harold Wavish. Greatorex blinked. Councillor Wavish's father. Grandfather, actually. A very prominent man in his day. Quite determined from what the minutes suggest. But what would Peebles want with all this? Greatorex asked. Purbright turned another page. A loose slip fluttered out a note in Peebles's handwriting, unmistakably his small, cramped script. "Inspector, look!" Greatorex exclaimed. Purbright picked up the slip. It contained a short list of names: Bloom, Fosdyke, Wavish, Harper, Dunning. At the bottom, underlined twice, 1956 Discrepancy Review. Greatorex felt a shiver. So these are people connected to the trustee scandal. "Yes," Purbright said softly. "Some are still alive, some whose families remain influential." He tucked the slip into his pocket. Mr. Peebles was not merely browsing for entertainment. Greatorex exhaled. "We should speak to Councillor Wavish again." In due course, Purbright replied. But not him first. Who then? Purbright closed the file with gentle finality. The person who seemed least eager for us to visit room 3. Greatorex frowned. Mrs. Fosdyke? She was helpful enough, Purbright said, but she also reacted interestingly when we mentioned these records. They stepped back into the corridor. Mrs. Fosdyke stood at her desk, straightening papers with the defensive diligence of someone pretending not to listen. Inspector, she said with forced brightness, I trust you found what you needed. My thanks, Purbright replied, though I'll need to revisit these files again soon. Her hands stiffened for a fraction of a second, too small for anyone except Purbright to register. He tipped his head politely and left with Greatorex in tow. Outside, dusk had settled in earnest, and the lamplight softened the outlines of the street. Purbright walked slowly, his steps thoughtful. A pattern was taking shape, one that began with an archivist's curiosity, wound its way through half-forgotten municipal decisions, and reached quietly into the present. Greatorex finally asked, Sir, you think this is about the trustees? Partly, Purbright said, but more than that, about the kind of memory small towns try to bury. Mr. Peebles disturbed something that preferred to stay undisturbed, and someone made sure he couldn't put it back. That, Purbright murmured, is what we must now discover. They walked on, the silence of the evening carrying its own faint, uneasy echo. The town seemed to settle around them, unaware that a quiet, dusty truth was beginning to stir after decades of polite concealment. The evening mist had begun to gather as Purbright and Greatorex reached the station. It softened the street lamps, making them appear like cautious, glowing eyes. The inspector paused at the doorway before entering, glancing back down the road toward the borough offices. The dim outline of the building sat perfectly still, as if feigning innocence. Inside, the station carried its usual late-day quiet. A vague smell of tea, the hum of an electric heater, and the muted clicking of typewriter keys from Constable Teal's desk. Teal looked up, hopeful. Anything I can get you, sir? Tea? Purbright declined with a gentle smile. No, thank you. But I would like you to send a message to Mrs. Fosdyke requested she provide us with the list of everyone who accessed the confidential trustee archives in the last 6 months. Teal hesitated. Do you think she'll give it willingly? Purbright gave a mild shrug. Willingly or reluctantly, the result should be the same. The reluctance will simply offer additional information. Teal nodded and set to work. Purbright moved into the small interview room, motioning for Greatorex to follow. The space was modest, 2 chairs, an aging desk, and a sense of polite, municipal gloom. Sergeant Purbright said, sitting down, What struck you most in room 3? Greatorex considered this. The name's on Peebles' slip, sir, and that someone, Mrs. Fosdyke or someone above her, didn't want the files handled. And what didn't strike you? Purbright asked quietly. Greatorex blinked. Sir, the absence of something, Purbright said. Sometimes it is the quiet parts of a room that speak loudest. Greatorex tried to pass the remark and, after a moment, accepted defeat. He leaned forward. Sir, do you think Councillor Wavish knows more than he's saying? He knows precisely as much as one might expect a civic-minded gentleman to know, Purbright replied, which is to say, enough to sound informed, not enough to be helpful, and possibly more than he ought to. Before Greatorex could ask further, there was a knock at the door. Constable Teal poked his head in, looking faintly self-conscious. Sir, there's someone here to see you. Mr. Bloom. Purbright exchanged a look with Greatorex. Please send him in. Mr. Cyril Bloom entered with the neat precision of a man who held his posture in high regard. Yet he looked slightly ruffled, like a book that had been opened too abruptly. Inspector, he began, clearing his throat. I apologize for calling so late. But after the unpleasantness in the library today, I found myself wondering if I should have said something earlier. Purbright looked up with faint interest. Earlier. Bloom nodded stiffly. About Mr. Peebles's visit. It wasn't the first time in recent weeks that he'd been searching for something in the records. He asked me privately if I knew whether there had ever been irregularities among the trustees. Greatorex leaned back slightly. Did you? Bloom bristled. Certainly not. My tenure as church warden requires impeccable record-keeping. Scandals are hardly conducive to parish harmony. And yet, Purbright said gently, you didn't mention this earlier. Bloom's shoulders drooped by a fraction. I didn't think it was important. Mr. Peebles was always finding ghosts in filing cabinets. I assumed it was another of his pursuits. Purbright did not rush him. And today, did anything else strike you before you found him? Bloom hesitated. There was a smell, Inspector. Faint but odd. Not the usual mustiness. More like, well, something acrid. I thought it might be a cleaning solution, but I didn't see any bottles. Purbright exchanged a subtle glance with Greatorex. You didn't notice anyone else near the reference room? Bloom shook his head. Only the volunteer, and she seemed half frightened by the microfilm machine. But there was a sound. Light footsteps in the corridor. I assumed it was Mrs. Birtwistle. Was it? Purbright asked quietly. Bloom paused. No. I recall seeing her at the front desk at the time. And the footsteps, Purbright prompted, moved in which direction? Toward the back exit, Bloom replied, though I cannot say who it was. The hall bends slightly. Someone small, perhaps. Light, hurried. Purbright thanked him with courteous gravity and escorted him back to the front hall, where Bloom departed with the air of a man relieved to have fulfilled his moral obligation. Greatorex broke the silence first. A grey coat, something red, hurried footsteps, an odd smell. Someone was in that room. Yes, Purbright murmured. And they were very particular about what they touched. Greatorex frowned. Sir, do you think Peebles was poisoned? Possibly. Or simply hurried along. But if poison was used, it would not be of the theatrical variety. Something that leaves no drama, only absence. Purbright rose, smoothing his coat. Come, let's visit someone who may provide a different sort of clarity. Who's that, sir? The volunteer, Purbright said. The one whose fear of the microfilm machine suggests she notices more than she is comfortable telling. They set off again into the misty evening. The streets had grown quiet, and Flaxborough's usual nocturnal air settled over the rooftops. The lights from the houses shone softly, hinting at supper tables and quiet routines. Yet beneath that comfortable facade, Purbright sensed the faint tremor of something old and unresolved. They reached the small terrace where the volunteer, Miss Trudy Heskett, lived. A light glowed in her front window. When Purbright knocked, she opened the door at once as though expecting someone, which surprised her as much as it surprised them. Oh, she said, adjusting her spectacles with trembling fingers. Inspector. Good evening, Miss Heskett, Purbright said with warm politeness. We won't keep you long. She stepped aside, ushering them into a modest sitting room where every surface was occupied by teacups, knitting needles, or books about nervous disorders. Miss Heskett, Purbright began gently, earlier today you mentioned a person leaving the library. Someone in a grey coat carrying something red. She nodded quickly. Yes, I didn't want to say too much earlier. Miss Birtwistle gets cross when volunteers over-elaborate. We encourage elaboration, Greatorex said solemnly. Miss Heskett's hands fluttered. Well, I didn't see the face. But I saw the hand holding the object. It was gloved, dark leather, and I'm fairly sure the person was a woman. Purbright tilted his head. What makes you think that? The stride, she said. Quick but careful, and the height. Not tall, not short. Just tidy. Tidy? Yes. Some people move like their shoes are apologizing. She moved like someone accustomed to being unnoticed. Purbright felt the faintest stir of recognition in the description of an outline forming, not yet a face. "And the red object?" he asked gently. Miss Heskett swallowed. "I think it was a folder, Inspector. A library folder, the kind Miss Birtwistle keeps for confidential requests." Purbright did not move, but his stillness was almost audible. "Thank you, Miss Heskett," he said softly. Outside, he and Greatorex paused under the weak glow of a street lamp. "Sir," Greatorex murmured. "A woman, tidy, gloved, carrying a confidential folder." "Yes, Sergeant, and only a few people have access to those." Purbright nodded once. "Miss Birtwistle?" Greatorex whispered. "Perhaps," Purbright said. "Or someone she trusted, however briefly." The mist curled around them, and Purbright felt the investigation shift, as though a door had quietly swung open in an unseen corridor. Someone in Flaxborough had touched those records recently, deliberately, and with the confidence of a person accustomed to handling secrets. Someone who expected not to be noticed. Mist followed Purbright and Greatorex back toward the center of Flaxborough, as though reluctant to let their conversation end at Miss Heskett's doorstep. It thinned and thickened by turns, sliding through the lamplight with quiet insistence. Purbright walked with his hands loosely clasped behind him, thinking deeply but looking as though admiring the predictable gloom of early evening. "Sir," Greatorex ventured after a few minutes, "if the woman Miss Heskett saw was carrying a confidential folder, wouldn't Miss Birtwistle know immediately if something had been taken?" "One would assume so," Purbright murmured. "But she didn't mention anything missing." "No," Purbright said with mild interest. "She did not." Greatorex frowned. "Do you think she's hiding something?" Purbright considered this without haste. "Miss Birtwistle hides things only if order requires it. But she may also conceal information she considers beneath police notice. Librarians sometimes have unusual hierarchies of significance." "Meaning?" "Meaning," Purbright replied gently. "She might believe the missing item, if indeed something is missing, was too trivial to trouble us with." Greatorex shook his head slowly. Hard to imagine a confidential folder being trivial. "True," Purbright said, "unless it contained something easily explained away, or something she hoped would stop explaining itself altogether." They were approaching the library again. Its dark windows glimmered faintly, reflecting the dull glow of the street lamps. The building seemed composed, impassive, but Purbright sensed a mild tension within it, like a well-kept house trying to disguise the fact that a single drawer had been quietly forced open. Inside, Miss Birtwistle stood at her central desk with an air of someone who had spent the hours since the earlier disturbance reorganizing the world into a shape more to her liking. Her spine straightened when she saw Purbright. "Inspector," she said, with a tone hovering between cordiality and criticism, "I assume you have further questions." Purbright smiled slightly. "Only a few. May we speak privately?" She led them into her small office, a room designed less for comfort than for control. Everything was labeled, filed, or indexed. Even the potted plant bore a discreet tag identifying it as Ficus Maintenance Schedule Adjacent. "Miss Birtwistle," Purbright began, standing with the mildness of a man requesting a cup of tea rather than pursuing a murder inquiry. "Are all the confidential request folders accounted for?" She blinked at him. "Of course." "May I see them?" Her lips thinned. Not refusal, merely irritation. She opened a drawer, extracted a slim stack of red folders, and set them neatly on the desk. Purbright leafed through them one by one. Their contents were pedestrian: special research requests, rare volume applications, a note about heating adjustments in the archival basement. He paused at the final folder. "This one," he said lightly. "A request for access to the 1950s trustee minutes. Filed yesterday." "Yes," she replied defensively. Mr. Peebles requested it. As I told you, it appears very tidy, Purbright observed. Almost untouched. That's because he looked at the original files in room 3, she said. And he did not remove any documents from here? Certainly not. I would have noticed. Purbright closed the folder gently. And yet, earlier today, a witness saw someone leaving with a red folder. Miss Burt Whistle stiffened. Then the witness was mistaken. Purbright's expression did not contradict her, but he noted the subtle tremor in her fingers as she picked up the folders and realigned them with excessive precision. Miss Burt Whistle, he said softly, is it possible that someone else with your permission could have accessed these? No, she said sharply. And is it possible, Purbright continued, that someone might have persuaded you temporarily to overlook a missing or borrowed folder? She drew herself up. Inspector, I do not overlook anything. Even so, Purbright murmured. Sometimes people appeal to our sense of propriety, or urgency, or even nostalgia. Her face tightened, and in that tightening Purbright caught a flicker of something: recognition, guilt, memory. It vanished almost instantly. Good evening, Inspector, she said coolly. If you have any more questions, I have a filing that needs completion. Purbright thanked her politely, and he and Greatorex stepped back into the corridor. The library seemed even quieter now, as though holding its breath. Greatorex muttered, "She's hiding something." "Perhaps," Purbright said. "Or she's hiding for someone." They left the library and began walking toward the station. The mist had grown thicker, curling around the lamp-posts like a faintly possessive cat. Purbright seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. Greatorex finally broke the silence. "Sir, if Miss Burt Whistle didn't take the folder, and the volunteer saw a woman with it, who else could have come into contact with those records?" Purbright slowed his steps. "Consider who benefits from certain truths being misplaced, who has history tied to 1956 trustee decisions, who possesses both motive and opportunity." Greatorex thought. "Mrs. Dallimer. She seems to have her fingers in everything." "No," Purbright said. "She would have broadcast her involvement before leaving the premises." "Mrs. Fosdyke." "A possibility," Purbright allowed. "She showed a moment's reluctance earlier. But she is careful to a fault. If she tampered with anything, she would have ensured we never knew it existed." Greatorex frowned. "So who, then?" Purbright exhaled softly. "A woman who moves quietly, efficiently. Someone used to handle documents. Someone whose family might have reasons to preserve the reputation attached to a particular surname." Greatorex blinked. "Wait, someone like Purbright. Cut him off with the faintest lift of the hand." "Let us not leap prematurely, Sergeant. We follow evidence, not anticipation." They reached the station. The air inside felt warmer, though the quiet murmur of paperwork filled the space like a low hymn. Before Purbright could remove his coat, Constable Teal hurried over with a small envelope. "Sir, Mrs. Fosdyke sent this over. Says it's the access list you requested." Purbright opened it. The list was painfully short. 2 names: Arnold Peebles, Harriet Wavish. Greatorex inhaled sharply. "Sir, that's the councillor's wife." Purbright folded the paper with care. "Yes, Sergeant. And according to Miss Heskett, our efficient, tidy, gloved visitor was a woman who preferred not to be noticed." Greatorex stared. "Do you think Mrs. Wavish was there today?" Purbright slipped the folded list into his pocket. "I think she may have been there more than once. And the folder she carried may not have been her first." Outside, the mist thickened again, pressing gently against the windows as though eager to hear what would come next, and Purbright, his steps slow and deliberate, knew that Flaxborough was beginning to reveal not a grand crime, but a small, quiet one shaped by pride, by fear, and by the kind of family memory that grows sharper with time rather than softer. Inspector Purbright sat for a moment in his office after reading the access list, letting the thin paper rest between his fingers as though it were something warm and faintly alive. Greater X paced the length of the room twice, then stopped abruptly, as though afraid his thoughts might outrun his senses. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice, though no one was nearby, "Mrs. Harriet Wavish logged access to the confidential records. That's not a coincidence." "No," Purbright agreed softly. "Coincidence is rarely so tidy. And she went in before Peebles." "Indeed." Greater X leaned forward. "Then she might have known what Peebles was looking for, or what he might find." Purbright didn't answer at once. His expression shifted only slightly, an almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes, as though a dim outline on a foggy window had just become recognizable. "Sergeant," he said at last, "when you consider Mrs. Wavish, do not picture her husband. Picture instead the habits of someone who manages the household of a counselor. Quiet supervision, carefully maintained appearances. A keen awareness of reputational fragility." Greater X scratched the side of his neck, meaning she might hide something for her husband. "Meaning," Purbright corrected gently, "she might hide something for her family. Not necessarily for him." He stood, reaching for his coat. "Let's pay them a visit." The Wavish home, a neat semi-detached on Priory Lane, presented itself with a kind of prim precision that suggested weekly polishing and stern opinions about lawns. Curtains parted the moment they approached, and by the time Purbright knocked, the door opened with the efficiency of someone who neither welcomed nor feared visitors, merely handled them. Mrs. Harriet Wavish stood framed in the doorway. She was of average height, her expression tidy rather than warm, and she held herself with the controlled energy of someone accustomed to smoothing away small domestic storms before they reached the table. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm, "my husband said there was some distress at the library. Is this about that poor archivist?" Purbright inclined his head. "In part, yes." "May we come in? We won't keep you long." She stepped aside with polite reluctance and led them into a sitting room arranged with symmetrical caution, every ornament paired, every cushion squared. Greater X surveyed the room as though expecting to find motives hidden inside the wallpaper pattern. "Would you like tea?" Harriet asked, with the air of someone offering it because etiquette required it, not because she wished them to stay long enough to drink it. Purbright smiled. "No, thank you." He remained standing, and after a moment she did the same, clasping her hands in front of her. "Mrs. Wavish," Purbright said gently, "we understand you accessed the trustee archives recently." Her fingers tightened slightly. "Yes, but that was quite legitimate, Inspector. I was looking into some information for the Historical Society. We're organizing an exhibit about early borough development." Greater X blinked. Purbright waited. "I signed the log properly," she added. There was nothing furtive about it. "No," Purbright said. "Not that part." Her eyes lifted to his, sharp enough to reveal that she had already anticipated the next question. "And," he continued softly, "were you in the library today?" Her mouth firmed. "I was not. I was at home all morning." Purbright did not contradict her. Miss Heskett mentioned seeing a woman leaving the library around the time Mr. Peebles was found. Grey coat, gloves, carrying a red folder. Mrs. Wavish blinked once. Slowly. "Lots of people wear grey coats in winter." "Yes," Purbright said, "but few have access to the confidential folders." Her composure remained intact, but it now required effort. "Inspector, I did nothing inappropriate. I accessed a set of records according to proper procedure. And as for today, I was not at the library." "Not even briefly?" Purbright asked quietly. "Not even to return a folder you might have borrowed? Or to retrieve one someone else borrowed?" A flicker passed across her expression. Not guilty annoyance. At the implication, at the intrusion, at the truth being tugged. "My husband is the counsellor," she said, as though stating that should clarify everything. "Our family name has always been respectable." Purbright nodded gently, precisely why some truths might feel inconvenient. Her breath caught, but only barely. "What exactly are you implying, Inspector?" "Nothing yet," Purbright replied, with the softness of someone turning down a lamp. "We are still gathering information. But I would like to know whether you and Mr. Peebles spoke recently." She opened her mouth, hesitated, closed it. "Not directly, but indirectly," Purbright prompted. She looked past him, toward a well-polished cabinet containing neatly arranged family photographs, none of which featured her husband. "Mr. Peebles," she said at last, "asked me a question some months ago about my grandfather. It was a passing remark. I thought nothing of it." Purbright did not move. What did he ask? Whether my grandfather, Harold Wavish, ever corrected an entry in the 1950s trustee minutes. Something about an endowment figure. She shook her head. "I assumed he was tracing a clerical error." "And did you tell him anything?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "I remembered nothing. It was before my time." "Did the question trouble you?" Purbright asked quietly. She drew a breath, steady but tight. "When someone mentions your family's past in an ambiguous tone, Inspector, it is difficult not to feel unsettled." Purbright studied her for a moment longer. "And did you tell your husband about Mr. Peebles' question?" She hesitated again, but this time only for a fraction of a second. "No, I didn't think it worthy of concern." Purbright nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Wavish. You've been very helpful." Her expression flickered with something like premature relief. Purbright noted, and she escorted them to the door. Outside, Greatorex exhaled. "Sir," she lied, not wildly, just enough to hide something. "Yes," Purbright said, "and she lies as one who fears the consequences less than the embarrassment." "Meaning?" "Meaning she did not kill Mr. Peebles," Purbright said softly, "but she knows someone who might fear what he discovered." They walked under the dim lamps of Priory Lane, the silence thickening around them. The pattern, faint but insistent, was beginning to take shape not around Harriet Wavish, but around the quiet way she protected a past she did not fully understand. Greatorex finally said, "Sir, who benefits most if the past stays buried?" Purbright stopped beneath the last lamp before the road bent away. "The one whose name appears in the record," he said quietly, "and the one who knew exactly which pages Peebles intended to read." The mist drifted across the street as they resumed walking, and Purbright felt the investigation shift once more toward the person who seemed to float unnoticed through the very rooms where the truth had waited, patient and undisturbed for decades. As Purbright and Greatorex walked back toward the center of town, the wind picked up just enough to stir the mist into delicate swirls. Flaxborough's windows glowed faintly, small warm squares of domesticity that pretended not to notice the stirrings beneath the surface of their peaceful market streets. Greatorex glanced at his superior, trying to read the inspector's expression, and failing as usual. "Sir," he said at last, "I can't decide if Mrs. Wavish is covering for someone else or covering for something she's not quite sure she understands." "Both are possible," Purbright replied, his tone mild. "But people who lie in small increments often do so not out of guilt, but out of habit. The habit of preserving order, reputation, stability. Like Miss Burt Whistle. In her own way, yes. Though Miss Burt Whistle safeguards rules. Mrs. Wavish safeguards lineage." They turned onto the high street, where a few shops remained open, their last-minute customers clutching carrier bags or vegetables, depending on their level of culinary ambition. The warm light from Grimble & Sons tailoring cast a long, soft glow across the pavement, illuminating the grey coat in the window, the same one that had caught Purbright's attention earlier. Greatorex noticed the inspector's glance. Sir, do you think she bought a new coat to replace the one Miss Heskett saw? Purbright allowed himself a faint, amused breath. Sergeant, a woman attempting to disguise her presence at the library, would not choose a coat entirely identical to her own. That would be considered redundant. So coincidence? No coat in a tailoring window is ever entirely coincidental, Purbright said, but it need not be connected to our case. Not directly. They continued another street, leaving behind the last of the shop fronts, the houses thinning into quieter residential rows. Purbright seemed to be steering them with deliberate slowness, as though ensuring each thought had time to settle. Greatorex asked, "Where are we going now, sir?" "To speak with someone who also has access to confidential materials, but whose motivations differ significantly from those of the councillors' wives." After a moment, Greatorex understood. Mrs. Fosdyke. Purbright nodded once. The borough offices were dimmer now, lit only by security lights. Mrs. Fosdyke, astonishingly, was still in her office, surrounded by papers as though time obeyed her rather than the reverse. She looked up when they entered, startled into something close to human expression before quickly resuming her administrative composure. "Inspector," she said sharply, "I've already sent the access list. If you require more, I must warn you that the archives are strictly regulated." "Your cooperation has been appreciated," Purbright said, the gentleness of his tone contrasting with the firmness of his purpose. "But we had a few more questions, purely procedural, of course." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Procedural?" Purbright stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Fosdyke, you have managed these records for years. You know their contents better than anyone. Were you aware that Mr. Peebles was examining the 1956 trustee minutes?" Her hands paused over the paperwork. "I became aware. Yes. He requested the key. I assumed it was for standard archival interest. And when Mrs. Harriet Wavish accessed the same files shortly before him?" Mrs. Fosdyke hesitated. "No regulations were violated," she said at last, defensively. "She was perfectly entitled to Mrs. Fosdyke," Purbright interrupted gently. "I'm not questioning entitlement. I'm asking about motivation." Her mouth tightened and her voice became a fraction more brittle. "Mrs. Wavish said she was researching for the Historical Society exhibit." "Indeed," Purbright said. "And did you believe her?" There was a small, telling silence. Finally, she said, "I believed she wished to appear helpful. She always does." Purbright watched her carefully. "Did she take anything from room 3? "No," Fosdyke said too quickly. "Impossible. I would know." Purbright let the silence settle. "Then perhaps she took something before returning the files." Another silence. Longer this time. Mrs. Fosdyke's voice dropped. "Inspector, whatever the Wavish family's past may be, dragging up old disputes does not benefit the town." Greatorex stiffened. "Is that why you didn't mention her visit earlier?" Mrs. Fosdyke flushed a rare human crack in her administrative armor. "The Wavishes are stalwarts of the borough. If something unpleasant existed in those files, if a misunderstanding occurred decades ago, bringing it forward now would only cause disruption." Purbright spoke very softly, "Which is exactly why Mr. Peebles may have been silenced." She went pale. "I didn't say anything," she whispered. "I didn't know." Purbright held up a hand. "We are not accusing you, Mrs. Fosdyke, but someone used the quiet passageways of local history to protect themselves. Someone who may rely on the fact that Flaxborough dislikes disturbance more than it likes truth." Her eyes searched his face, and she whispered, "I didn't want anyone hurt." Purbright nodded. "Neither do we." They left her desk in quiet order. Outside, the night air was sharper now, the mist lifting enough for the stars to peek through like polite observers. Greatorex walked in silence for several minutes before finally saying, "Sir, she's frightened." "Of scandal," Purbright said. "More than of guilt. But fear is useful. It tells us the past still has teeth. They reached Market Street again, where the last pub-goers were drifting inside, laughing with the simple confidence of people who believed they understood their town. Purbright paused at the corner, looking toward the unfriendly silhouette of the library. "Sergeant," he said softly. "Someone with access to files. Someone with a stake in the 1956 records. Someone who could walk the aisles unnoticed. That is no small circle." "Harriet Wavish fits," Greatorex said. "She does," Purbright agreed gently. "But someone else fits even more precisely. Someone whose job is to organize, handle, and correct the very history Mr. Peebles was trying to unravel." Greatorex frowned, trying to catch up. "Sir, you don't mean..." Purbright began walking again, very slowly. "For decades," he said, "someone has been filing the truth away, not hiding it, not destroying it, simply placing it out of reach, where no one bothers to look unless curiosity becomes inconvenient." The lamplight caught his profile for a moment, and when curiosity became inconvenient, he murmured, "Someone acted." Greatorex stopped dead. "Sir, Miss Burt Whistle." Purbright merely kept walking, not denying it, not confirming it, simply letting the truth like the dust in room 3 settle exactly where it chose. The following morning arrived with a thin, colorless light that made Flaxborough look as though someone had gently drained the town of enthusiasm. The mist had gone, leaving behind an air of stiff, chilly tidiness which Miss Burt Whistle herself might have approved. Purbright walked toward the borough library, with the mild deliberation of someone choosing not to rush what was already inevitable. Greatorex, beside him, glanced repeatedly at the inspector's expression and found it infuriatingly serene. "Sir," he muttered at last, "if you think Miss Burt Whistle might have been involved, well, don't. Librarians usually avoid anything messy." "True," Purbright agreed, "but librarians are also custodians. And custodians, Sergeant, sometimes protect things with an almost parental zeal. It depends on what they believe they are safeguarding. The records, or the town's dignity, or someone's memory, or simply the idea that the past ought to stay where it was put." He stepped through the library doors as Miss Burt Whistle looked up from her desk with the crisp surprise of someone greeted by a minor disruption to her expected day. She smoothed her skirt, straightened a bookmark display that had moved half a centimeter during the night, and fixed Purbright with her professional version of hospitality. "Inspector," she said, barely hiding the anticipation of more questions. "Back again?" Purbright returned her greeting with mild warmth. "Good morning, Miss Burt Whistle. We hope to trouble you only briefly." "I'm sure you will," she replied. Trouble tends to be concise when properly managed. Purbright gave no visible reaction. Instead, he let his eyes drift around the room, studying its stillness. It was too tidy for a place that had been the scene of sudden death less than 24 hours earlier. That kind of neatness suggested not efficiency, but correction. He stepped toward the reference room. "You won't find anything changed," Miss Burt Whistle called after him, voice edged with pride. "I restored everything to its proper order myself last night." "That," Purbright murmured to Greatorex, "is precisely what concerns me." The reference room smelled faintly different, still old paper and varnish, but now beneath it, something floral and antiseptic, like someone had attempted to erase the intangible. Purbright approached the table where Peebles had sat. The books were neatly closed now, their spines aligned with a discipline Miss Burt Whistle might have applied to her own posture. But Purbright was not concerned with the books. He crouched, examining the floor beneath the chair. "What are you looking for, sir?" Greatorex whispered. "A footprint," Purbright replied. "Footprint?" "There's none." "Precisely." Greatorex blinked. "Sir, it's a library." They scrubbed the floor. Purbright glanced up. Not scrubbed, polished, and only after someone removed a stain or spilled substance. Floors don't shine like this naturally, "Oh," Greatorex said, eyes widening. "Something spilled." "Yes," Purbright murmured, "and someone didn't want us to see what it was." He straightened just as Miss Birtwistle entered the room, her expression hovering somewhere between indignation and pride. "Inspector, if you intend to question my cleaning standards, I assure you they far exceed the borough's." Purbright turned to her, polite as ever. "Miss Birtwistle, you have always kept the library in excellent order. Yesterday must have been quite a disturbance." Her posture stiffened. It was deeply distressing, and I felt it my duty to restore the room's dignity. Purbright nodded once. "Did you, by chance, remove anything from the table before the officers arrived yesterday?" Her breath caught. Only a fraction, but noticeable. "I removed nothing," she said carefully. "Only righted what had been improperly handled. Books out of place, a chair slightly askew." "And the date stamp?" Purbright asked gently. Her fingers clenched around her sleeve. "That was dropped by Mr. Bloom. I corrected its position." Purbright let the silence fill the gap she did not intend to reveal. Then, without changing tone, he asked, "Miss Birtwistle, how long have you known Mrs. Harriet Wavish?" She blinked. "Do you know her?" "We are not close. She attends certain meetings." "She is very proper." "Proper," Purbright echoed. "And in particular?" Miss Birtwistle hesitated. "I suppose one could say that. And has she ever made special requests regarding archived materials? Perhaps concerning her family's history?" Miss Birtwistle's lips pressed together. "Inspector, I don't gossip, nor do I speculate on the private interests of patrons." "Of course not," Purbright said kindly. "But confidentiality has its subtleties. When someone asks to examine documents about their family's past, do they not sometimes ask you not directly to ensure such matters remain discreet?" She did not answer. Instead, she folded her hands with visible restraint and looked toward the table, anywhere but the inspector's eyes. Purbright continued softly, "You value order, Miss Birtwistle, and decorum. Mess, particularly public mess, offends you. So if someone entrusted you with the knowledge of an old mistake, a numerical inconsistency, or a clerical slip, you might feel it your duty not to perpetuate its impact." "That is not the same as wrongdoing," she said sharply. "No," Purbright agreed, "but assisting someone in protecting a family embarrassment is not the same as murder either." Her face was drained of color. "You think Purbright stepped closer, still gentle. "I think, Miss Birtwistle, that you found something on the table yesterday. Something you removed before calling the police." Greatorex stiffened behind him, watching her every breath. Miss Birtwistle swallowed hard. Her voice, when it came, cracked with the weight of something she had carried too long. "A paper," she whispered. "A small slip. Handwritten. It was lying near the map book. It contained a note." Purbright nodded once. "From Mr. Peebles?" "Yes." She closed her eyes briefly. "A list of names, with the figure, or 1956, beside them, and a question mark. Why did you remove it?" "Because," she said faintly, "I did not want to see the Wavish family dragged through gossip again. The borough still remembers the grandfather's scandal. His grandson has tried so hard to serve the community, and you feared the note would cause trouble." She nodded miserably. Purbright exhaled very softly. "But you removed more than that." "There was something else." She shook her head. Too quickly. Purbright waited. Finally, she whispered, "A bottle. Small. Brown." It had rolled under the table. I thought foolishly that it was a mislaid medicinal thing. I put it in the waste bin outside. "I did not realize until later that it wasn't harmless," Purbright said quietly. She looked at him with tear-bright indignation. "I was trying to protect the library, the town, not hiding a crime." Purbright nodded with a sympathy free of condescension. I know, but that bottle may have held the truth of Mr. Peebles's death. Greatorex asked, Do you still have it, miss? A tiny shake of the head. The bin lorry came this morning. Purbright closed his eyes once, briefly. Thank you, Miss Birtwistle. Your honesty now will help more than your discretion yesterday. She bowed her head as though accepting a verdict she already knew. Outside the library, Greatorex let out a long breath. Sir, so she hid evidence. She hid the wrong evidence, Purbright corrected quietly. The guilty never discard the thing that truly damns them. They discard what can be explained away. And the real killer. Purbright began walking again, the faintest trace of steel in his calm voice. Has not yet realized that the simplest detail barely noticed has already betrayed them. Which detail? Purbright didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said the net had finally begun to tighten. Inspector Purbright left the library with a slow, reflective pace that suggested he was not so much walking away from the scene as guiding the investigation into its final, inevitable shape. Greatorex followed closely, his steps heavier, his thoughts trying to keep stride with the inspector's quieter, sharper considerations. Sir, he said, lowering his voice even though the pavement was empty. Miss Birtwistle admitting to taking the paper and the bottle, it doesn't make her guilty, does it? No, Purbright replied gently. But it makes her useful. She has shown us what she thought important, and more crucially, what she did not understand. Greatorex frowned. Meaning she didn't know the bottle might have held poison? Meaning, Purbright said. She thought it mundane because it was placed mundanely. That is how the guilty wanted it to appear. They passed under a street lamp whose weak light flickered briefly. Purbright looked at it thoughtfully, then continued. The real question, Sergeant, is not who removed the bottle. It is who placed it where a librarian trained to notice disorder would think nothing of quietly tidying it away. Greatorex stiffened. Sir, someone used her habits against her. Yes, Purbright murmured. Her instinct to remove a small, out-of-place object was not only predictable, it was relied upon. For several moments, Greatorex walked in silence, replaying everything in his mind. Peebles in the chair, the books arranged too neatly, the absence of struggle, the smell Bloom described, the polished floor Miss Birtwistle insisted on restoring. Sir, he said slowly, what if Peebles didn't drink or swallow anything? What if the poison wasn't accidental at all? What if someone introduced it into the air around him? Purbright smiled faintly. You're getting warmer, warm enough to be dangerous. For someone, Purbright replied. He turned toward the borough offices, though he did not intend to enter. Instead, he paused at the rail overlooking the small garden behind the building, a place where clerks occasionally ate sandwiches and where secrets, Purbright suspected, had been whispered across decades. Sergeant, he asked softly, what did Mrs. Fosdyke intend when she said bringing up old disputes would only cause disruption? Greatorex thought. She meant the old trustee scandal. Yes, but she also meant something else. Something about the families involved, their reputations, their stability. Sir, Greatorex said slowly, she was protecting the Wavishes. Partly, Purbright said, but not the modern Wavishes. Someone older, someone whose involvement in the town's past might still cast a shadow. And Miss Birtwistle was protecting the library. Purbright nodded, each protecting their own corner, but neither truly knew what Peebles had uncovered. And what had he uncovered? Greatorex asked quietly. Purbright didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the windows of the borough offices, where a light flickered in one room. Peebles saw a discrepancy, Purbright said at last. A name wrongly placed, a sum that did not match, a trustee's signature that should not have existed on a particular page. Something small, something easily dismissed, but Peebles was a man who did not dismiss small things. "And that's why he was killed," Greatorex said. Purbright replied, "And because someone feared he would speak to the wrong person before they could intervene." Greatorex blinked. "You think he tried to warn someone?" Purbright nodded gently, and the guilty person anticipated it. He turned away from the garden. "Let's visit Councillor Wavish." Greatorex looked uneasy. "Sir, he didn't seem dangerous." "Danger," Purbright said softly, "rarely announces itself with dramatic gestures in Flaxborough. It prefers to arrive wearing gloves and correct grammar." They reached the Wavish residence just as dusk deepened into something darker. A light glowed through the sitting-room curtains. Purbright knocked. This time Councillor Roger Wavish answered, not his wife. He looked mildly harried, as though a day of committee tasks had worn him into a resigned fog. "Inspector," he said, his tone polite but uncertain. "My wife mentioned you visited yesterday. Is there progress?" "Some," Purbright said. "May we come in?" Wavish hesitated a moment too long before stepping aside. The sitting room still bore its pristine symmetry, though now a faint scent of furniture polish lingered, suggesting hurried tidying. Mrs. Wavish was not present. "Is your wife at home?" Purbright asked. Wavish cleared his throat. She stepped out. "Errand. Something about floral arrangements." Purbright nodded, though he clearly didn't believe a word of it. "Councillor," Purbright began gently, "did your grandfather ever speak of the trustee scandal in the 1950s? Wavish blinked. "My grandfather? Oh no, he died when I was a child. My father mentioned it a few times. Said it was all blown out of proportion. Did he say what caused the confusion?" "Some accounting matters. A missed figure or over-reported funds." "Nothing criminal, just a clerical error." Purbright watched him calmly. "And do you know who discovered the error?" Wavish frowned. "Inspector, surely this is irrelevant. Something happened at the library. You're not here to question my family's history." Purbright smiled kindly. "On the contrary, Councillor, I'm here to understand why Mr. Peebles died." That landed with the softness of a falling curtain, but the weight of a verdict. Wavish stiffened, color rising in his face. "I didn't kill him," he snapped. "If that's what you're implying." "I am implying," Purbright said softly, "that your wife tried to prevent disturbance. And Miss Burt Whistle tried to preserve order, and Mrs. Fosdyke tried to protect the borough. But none of them killed Peebles." Greatorex held his breath. Purbright's voice dropped, gentle as silk. "Which leaves someone who didn't try to prevent disturbance, but instead tried to control it." Wavish stared at him. "I don't know what you mean." Purbright leaned in slightly. "Councillor, when Miss Heskett described the person leaving the library, she focused on the hand. Gloved. Dark leather. The stride, she said, was tidy, but she did not say it was a woman's stride. Only care. Only controlled. Only discreet." The color drained from Wavish's face. Purbright finished calmly, "And only one person in this house owns gloves matching that description, as observed by my sergeant when we arrived." Greatorex nodded silently. Roger Wavish opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a man realizing he had rehearsed for the wrong scene entirely. Purbright stepped back. "Councillor, we will need you to come with us." Wavish sagged into the nearest chair, not protesting, not arguing, simply collapsing inward as though decades of unspoken pressure had finally decided to collect their bill. Purbright waited, not triumphantly, not impatiently, just with quiet inevitability, because the next section would be the reveal, and Flaxborough's final truth was ready to come out from the dust. Inspector Purbright did not arrest Councillor Wavish on the spot. He merely asked the man to accompany him to the station, and Wavish, pale, shaking, and far older in posture than he had been an hour before, obeyed without argument. Greatorex walked beside him, not gripping his arm, but remaining close enough that Wavish could feel the weight of inevitability. They placed him in the interview room, not harshly, but with the kind of courtesy that made resistance look pointless. Purbright sat opposite him, hands folded, expression as gentle as if discussing the weather. "Counselor," he began quietly, "no one wishes to assume guilt, where misunderstanding may exist, but we must follow the facts, however politely they present themselves." Wavish swallowed hard. I didn't intend," he faltered, staring at the table. Purbright waited. "I didn't kill him," Wavish whispered. "Not deliberately." Purbright sighed softly. "Deliberate or not, Mr. Peebles is dead, and what remains is to understand why." Wavish's hands trembled. He clasped them together as though trying to keep the truth from leaking out too quickly. "It was the note," he said, "the one he left on the table. My name, my family's name, written beside an old date. I saw it when I went into the library yesterday morning, before anyone else had arrived. I only meant to take the note, to talk to him, to ask why he was digging through those records." "The folder?" Purbright asked softly. Wavish nodded. "Miserable. I panicked. I picked up one of the red folders from the desk to hide the note as I walked out. I thought it would look less suspicious." "And did you read the note?" Wavish nodded again. He'd discovered an error in the 1956 accounts, a figure my grandfather had insisted upon. It was wrong, not fraudulent, not theft, just wrong. But it caused a minor scandal then, and I thought if it reappeared, people would talk. "People always talk," Purbright said mildly. "Rarely with accuracy, but always with enthusiasm." Wavish gave a small, broken laugh that wasn't laughter at all. "I thought I could find Peebles before he spoke to anyone. Explain things, make him understand why revisiting the past would ruin my father, my wife, my family name." "Did you find him?" Wavish flinched. I returned to the library later. He was already in the reference room. "And what did you do?" Purbright asked gently. Wavish pressed a shaking hand to his face. I wanted to talk to him, but he was so absorbed in the books he didn't even look up. I stood behind him for a moment. Then I saw the bottle, the small brown one. Purbright leaned forward. "What made you pick it up?" "I recognized it," Wavish whispered. "My father used to keep the same sort, an inhalant for sinus trouble. Harmless. At least I thought so. And then, I thought if Peebles saw me there, he'd know I'd taken the note. He'd realize why." I panicked. Wavish's voice cracked. I placed the bottle beside him. I thought he might get up, smell it, ask whose it was. I thought it would give me a way into the conversation. Purbright's expression softened with something like pity, but it wasn't a harmless inhalant. "No," Wavish whispered. "It must have been something my father mixed. He experimented with compounds, old-fashioned remedies. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Purbright let the silence settle. A tender silence, not accusing, not forgiving, just allowing the truth to sit, visible for the first time. "You meant only to frighten him," Purbright said. Wavish nodded miserably. "But he must have opened it. He must have inhaled whatever was inside." He collapsed. "And I—" His voice broke. "I fled. And when you returned later," Purbright said gently, Miss Burt Whistle had already removed the note and the bottle. "I thought the whole thing had been resolved," Wavish whispered, "until the police came." Purbright looked at him with grave calm. "Counselor, Mr. Peebles died because he trusted the quiet of that room, and because you trusted an old bottle, you should never have moved." Wavish closed his eyes. "What happens now?" "Now," Purbright said softly, We speak again with a solicitor present, and we determine whether this was negligence, panic, or something else." He rose slowly, signaling Greatorex to escort the counsellor. When the door closed behind them, Purbright remained in the empty room for a long moment, hands resting lightly on the table. The quiet in the station was different from the quiet in the library, a quiet without secrecy, without dusted-over mistakes. Greatorex returned after a few minutes. "Sir, he's with Teal now. Should I fetch Mrs. Wavish?" "Not yet," Purbright replied. "Let her have a little more time to believe her husband has solved the matter with dignity." Greatorex looked at him, baffled. "Sir, you're very calm." Purbright smiled faintly. "Sergeant Flaxborough has survived worse than a tragic mistake wrapped in 50-year-old embarrassment. Its dignity will recover. And Mr. Peebles?" Purbright's smile faded, replaced by something softer. He was a man who disliked disorder. In a sense, the town owes him for uncovering the one bit of chaos it had never properly sorted. They walked back toward the front of the station. Outside the windows, the morning had finally brightened. Shopkeepers were sweeping their thresholds. Children were marching toward school with various degrees of enthusiasm, and the borough library returned to its usual hum of quiet purpose. Miss Birtwistle would already be shelving some book with precise authority, unaware or pretending so that her actions had guided the investigation as much as the evidence itself. Purbright paused at the station doorway, watching Flaxborough resume its rhythm. "Well, Sergeant," he said calmly, "I suppose life will now continue at its usual pace." Greatorex nodded, though his expression still held the lingering shock of the unraveled truth. "Sir," he said, "did you know from the beginning?" Purbright adjusted his hat with mild amusement. "Not from the beginning, but from the moment Miss Heskett mentioned the gloved hand and the manner of the stride, I suspected someone accustomed to presenting correctness. Councillor Wavish wears his dignity like a coat, and coats can be traced." Greatorex looked at him admiringly. "You're a clever one, sir." Purbright shook his head gently. "Not clever, Sergeant. Just willing to listen when people reveal themselves. They always do." He stepped outside into the cool air, hands behind his back, ready to return to the paperwork that awaited him, quiet, orderly, blessedly unremarkable. Behind him, the case of Arnold Peebles rested at last, and Flaxborough, in its small and stubborn way, settled back into the peaceful posture it wore so well.